The original idea about the UFC came to me in 1989. I had sourced an article about Rorion Gracie in the September issue of Playboy magazine. And of course, I wasn't looking at the pictures. I was just reading the article. And it's all about the Gracies down in Brazil. These guys were willing to get on a mat or a ring and challenge guys from other disciplines.
I was doing pay-per-view, but basically for rock and roll bands. And I had a friend who was head of the New York State Taekwondo Association. And one day I said to him, there's all these Taekwondo people, all these karate people, and I'll bet they would want to know who would win the fight. The following week, Rorion and Art Davie came to me and said, what about jiu-jitsu? I said, let them all fight.
And I said, what it should be called is the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And Art said, so why? I said, because there's nothing beyond ultimate.
Early on, we had to decide what kind of an arena we were going to put this in. I wanted it bigger than a boxing ring. I had guys from so many different disciplines that I didn't want to make this in a phone booth. And then I came up with the idea of electrifying an outer ring. And one of Rorion's students, who was a cardiologist, said, have you ever heard the word, Art Davie, ventricular fibrillation? I said, what's that? So that idea was out.
Rorion Gracie had a student, John Milius, a famous movie writer and director.
I love the smell of napalm in the morning.
We went to visit John Milius.
John made reference to the fact that he's got Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan the Barbarian fighting in a pit.
And John Milius suggested an octagon. Now, he also suggested that we dig it into a pit, that we have guys with torches standing around there.
We talked about Vestal Virgins coming in on white horses and having 140 anti-aircraft lights like Lenny Riefenstahl did in Triumph of the Will, and lining the pathway to the arena.
That didn't appeal to me, but the octagon, which would be a different way to do an event, that appealed to me.
In all fairness, it really wasn't John Milius's idea.
I started out as a designer, and the first job that I did was on Pee-wee's Playhouse, and was actually inside Punky 2000, the robot. I got a call from Michael Pilot one morning. They were looking for someone to design the arena for UFC 1. The first things I did were a circular raised platform in the middle with fencing on the outside. Another one was a square platform, so like a box ring, but the inside was raised. Got a little more theatrical with fencing and barbed wire on the outside and some torches. The last one that I came up with was a 8-sided ring with a chest-high chain link fence around the outside. The octagon was unique. It was a unique shape.
Again, the concept being John Milius.
Nobody ever mentioned John Milius, and I didn't know John Milius was involved. Once I got the okay from SEG, the next step was the process of getting it built. So I gave a fellow I'd worked with quite a bit, Jason Cusson, a call, and he took on the job of getting it built.
Greg Harrison likes to think that he created the octagon because he drew the pictures. Greg didn't want his name attached to it in any way until it started getting successful. I knew nothing about martial arts. I had seen Chuck Norris. There was an old movie called The Octagon. I had seen it when I was a kid, and that's how the octagon became an octagon. Yeah! They wanted something that was going to keep the fighters contained. We had talked about plexiglass and decided that could be too dangerous for the fighters. And I happened across this vinyl-coated chain link fence, and that solved that problem. Greg was doing a lot of traveling. He asked me if I could take it over. So what would happen is I would describe to Greg different ideas, and he would draw them because he's an illustrator and I'm not. And then I built the octagon.
I lived in New York. SEG was in New York. I designed the octagon in New York. Where was Cusson? In LA. The set builder dictated the octagon designs. To me, that's absurd.
When you talk to a designer, you give the designer something to do.
Bob Meyerowitz introduced me to Art Davie and Rorion Gracie. From day one, the most important thing that we had to do was to make sure it looks like nothing they've ever seen. When someone buys a boxing event, they see a ring. And I said, it can't look like a ring. It's got to look different. And I said, let's just make it 8 sides. Greg, he had that information when he drew the sketches.
They knew I created the Octagon. My whole life I was doing fights. I started judo when I was 5 in El Paso, Texas. I was fighting in the streets, and I came to California, and then I started getting into all the martial arts. I had this idea. I said, I want to do a show. We'll call it Cage of Rage. The first one I built was real high because I wanted to do stick fight. Instead of 6 feet high, it was 12 feet high. My show was February of 1993. The UFC wasn't until November of 93. Art Davie came to my show, and the Gracies came to my show.
I drove out with Hoist, and when the 2 fighters showed up, one dressed in a futuristic way and the other dressed like in a military way, they looked like wrestlers. I looked at what they were doing, and it was a tall, 4-sided wrestling type cage.
It was an octagon shape.
Hoist seemed to be bored. We stayed for only 2 bouts, and Hoist looked at me and said, let's go get some Brazilian food.
If I didn't do Cage of Rage in the octagon, they would never have done it in an octagon.
If SEG knew they wanted an octagon before they called me in, why would I waste precious time showing P-Lot round and square fighting rings? That makes no sense. SEG didn't know what they wanted until they saw my octagon design.
My recollection and memory is the guy who had the most responsibility for the creation of the octagon is Jason Cusson.
Gregory Harrison was the designer. Jason Cousin was the architect. But Michael P-Lot came up with the concept.
It's interesting to me, all the people who now say they conceived the octagon were not designers, and yet somehow they all came up with the octagon design.
You don't need a design degree to come up with an octagon.
Success has 1,000 parents. Failure has none.
That is the power of jiu-jitsu in action.
After the first UFC, I had the crew help me put all of it on racks so we could take it out to the dumpsters out back because we were pretty certain they're never going to let us do this again. And all of a sudden, Art Davie came running out.
Bob and I paid $28,000 for that.
He said, I want to store this just in case. We might try this again.